COVID-19 pandemic. It's sponsored by Medical Education Cooperation with Cuba, which we affectionately call MEDICC, and MEDICC Review, our quarterly online peer-reviewed and open access journal publishing articles in English relevant to global health equity, offering, we think, the best of medical, public health, and social sciences research by Cuban and other developing country professionals. My name is Dr. Bill Keck, and I'm the Executive Director of MEDICC and Editor-in-Chief of MEDICC Review. Well, ideally, our session today would feature Cuban professionals currently leading the country's pandemic response, but Cubans
Dr. Keck, I think you're muted. We were unable to hear you. You might need to back up about 20 seconds. We can hear you now.
All right, did you hear me from the beginning?
Yes, but you cut off at about ideally having Cuban representatives with you.
All right, thank you. So the Cuban representatives, of course, can't be here because they're blocked from using Zoom, but we believe that story bears telling to the degree we're capable. So we've asked two members of our journal's editorial team who've been following pandemic events in Cuba closely to bring us up to date. So let me introduce them to you. First, we have Gail Reed, Executive Editor of MEDICC Review. Ms. Reed has an MS degree from the Columbia School of Journalism and has made Cuba her professional base for well over 30 years now. She's the author of a study of the impact of the US embargo on the Cuban health system, the founder of MEDICC, the producer of the award-winning film Salud, and the founder and driving force behind the journal. She delivered a TED-Med talk in 2014 on medical training in Cuba and has served as a consultant to the Atlantic Philanthropies, various US foundations, and UNICEF Cuba. Also with us is Dr. Caitlin Baird, Senior Editor of the English edition of MEDICC Review. Dr. Baird holds a doctorate in applied medical anthropology from the University of Florida. Before joining MEDICC Review, she worked as a researcher for 15 years, transitioning from cellular biology to global health research in 2009. She has over a decade's experience living and working in Latin America. And as an editor, as in her research, she emphasizes collaborative, cross-disciplinary research and social equity in health and healthcare. So as you listen to the presentations and questions develop in your mind, please use the chat box provision to ask them. We're being assisted by Elizabeth Sayre, who's been sending you emails. She's director of MEDICC's Gateways program, and she and I will be monitoring those questions. So after our presenters have finished, we'll do our best to get to those questions. And if time and circumstances permit, we'll try opening the mic for some dialogue. So let me stop talking then and ask Dr. Baird if she would begin.
Hi, everyone. Again, the name of today's session is Cuba versus COVID-19, 10 strategies that matter for us. By any measure, Cuba has done remarkably well thus far in battling the COVID-19 pandemic. Taking data from the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center this morning, Cuba has had, as of today, 6,727 confirmed cases and 128 deaths from the virus, or 59 deaths per 100,000 members of their population. If you contrast Cuba's COVID-19 numbers with that of the US, for example, its much better resource neighbor to the north, Cuba is doing remarkably well by comparison. Contrasted against Cuba's 59 deaths per 100,000, the US to date is experiencing 2,668 deaths per 100,000 individuals, or almost a 60-fold increase. This puts the US at 8,790,206 confirmed cases as of this morning, and 226,864 deaths, a number which many epidemiologists estimates to be at the low end of the actual number. This week, the US saw the largest number of COVID-19 cases in one day at 77,000 cases, and the US is preparing to enter its largest peak of COVID-19 infections to date, having never recovered fully from the first two peaks. In early 2019, the Global Health Security Index ranked the US as the country most prepared to respond to an epidemic or a pandemic, and yet here we are at the end of 2020, and the US is faring the worst during the COVID-19 pandemic of all countries worldwide. Meanwhile, other countries with far fewer resources at their disposal, Cuba included, have fielded responses that have been much more successful in protecting their population from the COVID-19 pandemic. Cuba especially has done so under an increasingly strained and complicated economic situation, as 120 new US sanctions have been leveled against the country at this year alone. Given the information that we have at hand, it's impossible to not ask the question of what Cuba has done right in handling the pandemic and what the rest of the world could stand to learn from their response. For this, I'm gonna ask Gail Reed to elaborate.
Thank you, Caitlin, and thanks, Bill, and thanks everyone for being on board today. I'm hoping that you're not zoomed out, thinking that perhaps you had already been PowerPointed out. We decided not to burden you with another one. Sorry, but I will try to read from some of my notes. One small correction on the figures for Cuba. It's not the deaths that are 59 per 100,000, it's the cases. The deaths end up being just 1 per 100,000 as compared to the US's 68. And I might say that it's not only the United States, it's all of the Western Hemisphere, which is now, of course, the epicenter of the pandemic, and many of the other Latin American countries, with the notable exception of Uruguay and of course some of the Caribbean islands, are really in deep trouble around this, beginning with Brazil, but not ending with Brazil. Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Chile, where my son is right now, these are all countries that are very, very poorly at this point, with the numbers just seemingly impossible to get under control. So with that, let me begin to take a look at the situation in Cuba and what are the strategies that we can learn from. I think the number one lesson or strategy, and perhaps one that it may be too late to learn from, is that Cuba started out with a single national multi-sector plan led by its president and the health sector. A plan that is regularly monitored by the president, the ministers, health authorities, and that also includes social and economic aspects to protect vulnerable groups, salaries, virtual learning, all kinds of other aspects, social and economic. In January, they approved the plan. By February 1, it was in place. Now, this is well before the first cases were diagnosed on March 11th. So for a full look at what this has meant over the months, I'd encourage you to take a look at the April and July issues of our journal, which has it in timetable fashion. And that's at www.mediccreview.org. But just to review a few of the measures. The plan meant that in January, they were already screening at ports and airports, training personnel, and by February, they'd reorganized the health system to deal with COVID-19. It was and is a multi-sector approach, providing for telecommuting where possible, teleclasses after schools closed in March, when also international travel was restricted to returning residents. Salaries were protected of working mothers. Debt repayment and taxes were postponed for small businesses. And those in vulnerable groups, such as elders, had food and medicines delivered at home. Safety protocols were put in place in institutions such as nursing homes and prisons, and for health workers as well. So by April, there was a mental health care plan also in place. By June, a 3-phased post-epidemic recovery plan, and by July, tourism to the Keys north of Cuba was being renewed. Later, they would move to other areas. What's been the importance of all of this? Both the introduction into and the eventual gradual phased recovery process have been phased, gradual, depending on the epidemiological picture, whether it's by town, by province, or by the nation as a whole. So right now, Cuba is entering a period they're calling the new normal, in which mandatory masks, physical distancing, and hygiene measures are being maintained, but other restrictions are lifted where the epidemiological picture permits. So last week in Cuba, what did it look like? There were 450 total active cases. 351 of these were new cases over the week, as opposed to the 500,000 that Caitlin just referred to in the US. And as she also mentioned, 6,727 cases have now been registered in Cuba as a whole since March. 91% have recovered with just 128 deaths. So what is the second lesson, number 2, that we can take away from Cuba? It's an evidence-based scientific approach, sharing knowledge within Cuba and pouring in from abroad. They have been relying all along on public health science, medical science, and their own experience in this regard with other epidemics such as dengue, cholera, and so on. Applying this science then has resulted in mandatory social distancing, masking, closing borders for a time, frequent hand washing guidelines, prohibitions on large gatherings, closing bars, restaurants, and tourism resorts, limiting public transportation, and shutting down non-essential work. Shelter at home for seniors and other vulnerable groups. By March, they had 155 workshops producing face masks. The epidemiology of the virus has been their guide. Lesson number 3, a clear, transparent, single and regular public health message. Starting in February, when the Cuban Health Network launched the COVID-19 app to provide current information, public health education has been a key element of the Cuban strategy. President Miguel Diaz-Canel, wearing a mask, has been a frequent guest on primetime television, which carried the first measures adopted as early as March 9. Then by March 17, daily morning press conferences began, reporting the current extent of the epidemic with serious cases and deaths described in detail: age, residence, comorbidities, numbers of contacts, all but their names. So this has been reinforced since then in social media bulletins, newspaper, and local television across the country. And the most important thing, it's a single message. It's a public message. It's a transparent message.
From what I understand, all Cuban strategies that relied on public cooperation were undergirded initially by an investment in public health education and a trust in the Cuban universal public health system that has been built over decades. The Cuban healthcare system is universal, government funded, and free of charge. And unlike some countries who have enshrined universal healthcare in their constitutions, but for one reason or another find themselves unable to actually deliver on that promise, Cuba has invested heavily in public health and the accessibility of services, something which shows in their health outcomes, with life expectancies and infant mortality rates outstripping the US, despite a lower per capita investment in healthcare. Surely this already underlying investment played a large role in shaping the Cuban response to COVID-19.
Absolutely, and that gets us to lesson 4, which is the key role of primary health care and its professionals. I think this is a critical and somewhat unique element in terms of COVID response. PAHO early supplied some PCR tests to Cuba, but not all that were needed. So the country played to its strengths, and 35,000 family doctors, nurses, and medical students were deployed to households throughout the country to carry out active case finding and public education at the same time. They were reaching as many as 3 million people a day at the high points, and their role would become even more important as the pandemic evolved, which takes us then to lesson number 5, test, trace, and isolate. That's not anything new, but they actually did it. The primary care professionals were then key to early contact tracing of all cases and suspected cases, so that now over 90% of newly confirmed cases have resulted from this contact tracing. Contacts, as well as new arrivals from abroad, spent an obligatory 14-day period in isolation centers, a boarding school, a converted university dorm, where they were monitored and tested. 200 of these centers were opened across the country. No small feat when you consider that not only were they contact tracing, but they were also tracing and testing 5,000 Cubans who were repatriated from 56 countries. So if you fast forward to today in the current new normal phase, the isolation centers have now been replaced by shelter at home or shelter at hotel or shelter at guest house. Family doctors and nurses, once again, are charged with follow-up on contacts, travelers, and also recovered COVID-19 patients. And at the same time, more PCR tests were becoming available, and the original 4 laboratories for processing these has expanded to 13 at latest count in 5 different provinces. So number 6, another, and I think now completely unique aspect to Cuba for its response to COVID-19. Cuba has hospitalized every single confirmed case, every single patient with confirmed COVID-19. I think this is the only country that has done this. I was reading that perhaps Hong Kong has done something similar. At any rate, at the peak, the country had 41 hospitals and 7,700 beds readied for these patients, 861 in ICUs. But according to PAHO, they never had to use more than 20% of these capacities. Interestingly enough, I think, hospitalization did make it possible to remove sick people from the home environment and avoiding contagion to other family members. Now that's important in Cuba, but also in communities worldwide, where households can be either large or multi-generational.
And in part out of the necessity created by the US sanctions against Cuba, Cuba has developed over the past several decades a thriving biotechnology industry. I'm taking many of the following figures from an interview with Dr. Dagmar Garcia, the Director of Research at the Finley Vaccine Institute, which will be published in MEDICC Review's October 2020 issue within the next few days. So despite the fact that I edit it, please let me read this because I certainly haven't memorized it. Cuba's biotechnology industry is comprised of more than 30 research institutes and manufacturing companies in the state-owned conglomerate BioCuba Pharma, which has developed and distributed vaccines according to international standards of good clinical and manufacturing practices and protocols for decades. BioCuba Pharma supplies over 800 products to Cuba's national health system. 349 of those are on Cuba's basic drug list, the medicines approved for use in the country's health system. Additionally, BioCuba Pharma has 2,438 patents registered outside Cuba, and its products, including vaccines, medicines, and medical equipment, are in 100 simultaneous trials at 200 clinical sites and are registered and sold in more than 50 countries. These factors proved advantageous for making a fast, confident pivot toward COVID-19 vaccine development. Specifically, these prior successes meant all necessary technical capacities and regulatory certifications were already in place. Founded in 1989, SecMed was certified as a WHO Level 4 regulatory authority of reference for vaccine control, the highest certification level conferred in 2017. Also in 1989, a team at Cuba's Finley Vaccine Institute led by Dr. Concepcion Campa developed VA meningococ BC, the world's first safe, effective vaccine against serogroup B meningococcus. And in 2000, Cuba's recombinant hepatitis B vaccine received WHO PAHO pre-qualification. To date, millions of people in Cuba and elsewhere have been immunized against a variety of diseases with vaccines that came directly from the island. Shortly after COVID-19 was declared a pandemic by the WHO, this expertise was marshaled to develop a Cuban vaccine against the disease. And I believe Gail can probably speak more to this.
Right, so I think that before we get to the vaccines as a whole, I think it's important to mention also lesson number 7, that Cuban health professionals, medical professionals, quickly devised protocols for treating patients with COVID-19, and that involved applying many of the same drugs used worldwide and also some of their own. And these were general protocols, but also very patient-specific treatments. As anyone involved in the clinical treatment of COVID-19 patients knows, this is a very delicate disease in terms of the need that it has for patients really to be tailored to geared to individuals. So the Cuban therapies are the result of investments in pharma and biotech that Caitlin mentioned. And as a result, just 4.4% of patients in Cuba have reached a serious or critical stage. That's 4.4%. And instead of the only 60% of those seriously ill who survive, over 80% of the seriously ill in Cuban hospitals have survived. So we're beginning to see results from this strategy of hospitalization plus patient-specific treatment. So lesson number 8 does revolve around the fast tracking of drug and vaccine development. Just days before the first cases were diagnosed in March, a science and biotech group of experts was established in Havana to get to work on therapies and vaccines for COVID-19. Now, the results have brought not only diagnostic kits and domestically produced ventilators, but also repurposed drugs, new medications, and at least 2 vaccines in clinical trials, with more in the pipeline. So here are a few examples of what I'm talking about. Jusvinsa is a peptide which has been approved for emergency use in seriously ill patients. It's an immunoregulator with anti-inflammatory properties. Thus far, used in 70 very seriously ill patients, they have a 94% survival rate. Now these monoclonal antibodies are always tough to pronounce. This is itolizumab. It's a monoclonal antibody that's been approved by SecMed for expanded compassionate use and given to serious and critical patients to reduce the risk of the cytokine storm with excellent results. CIGB 325 is in clinical trials aimed at reducing lung lesions. And heberferon, a combination of interferons already registered for other uses, it's now being used as an immunomodulator with antiviral properties. And there's one that's being used for prevention, which is biomodulina T, being used in over 20,000 vulnerable people because, mainly older adults, because it stimulates their immune system. So those are on the biotech and pharma front for treatment and prevention. When you get to the vaccines, there are 2 vaccines, or 1 vaccine and 2 formulations and dosages now in clinical trials, Soberana 1 and Soberana 1A. These are both based on one of the vaccines Caitlin referred to, Cuba's meningitis BC vaccine, that's been in use for over 30 years now. Soberana 1 is in phase 1-2 trials in some 700 volunteers, and similarly 1A is just beginning these trials. These are the only Latin American vaccine candidates, the only ones out of Latin America. Soberana 2 was just approved for clinical trials. It has gone through all of the preclinical stages up until now. It is based on the Cuban Haemophilus influenza vaccine. a vaccine that won the World Intellectual Property Organization's gold medal when it was first developed. So both these vaccine candidates, or all three, are on platforms that have excellent safety records, which is important